The Cold War, a battle for global supremacy. The United States and the Soviet Union were the world's two superpowers following World War II. They developed a rivalry as they each aimed to keep the other from acquiring excessive authority. The Cold War was the name given to the period of conflict between them. Despite the fact that the two countries did not actually go to war, the dispute did spark a number of lesser wars. Welcome to the History Hub, subscribe and let's dive in. Cold War, a competition and antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies, that began to emerge after World War II. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe frightened the United States and Britain, who feared the spread of Soviet influence and communism in Western Europe and worldwide. In order to protect themselves from a potential resurgence of German aggression, the Soviets were adamant about keeping control of Eastern Europe. The term Cold War was originally coined by Bernard Baruch in a 1947 congressional debate. It was mostly fought on the fronts of politics, economics, and propaganda, with little to no employment of actual weapons. With the Berlin Airlift and blockade, NATO's establishment, the Communists' triumph in the Chinese Civil War, and the Korean War, it reached its zenith in 1948 to 1953. With the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1958 to 1962, which led to a buildup of weapons on both sides, the conflict entered another intensive phase. After a détente in the 1970s, tensions flared up again. But let's look deeper. The Cold War was an open but restrained competition that emerged between the US and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies, following World War II. There was little use of firearms throughout the Cold War since it was fought on political, economic, and media fronts. The phrase was first used in a 1945 article by English writer George Orwell to describe a nuclear standoff between two or three monstrous superstates, each possessed of a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. In 1947, American banker and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch used it for the first time at a speech at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. Near the end of World War II, in May 1945, Nazi Germany submitted, and the tense alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States that had been formed during the conflict started to fall apart. In the nations of Eastern Europe that the Red Army had freed by 1948, the Soviets had erected left-wing regimes. The Soviet Union's enduring control over Eastern Europe and the possibility of communist parties with Soviet influences gaining power in Western Europe's democracies were fears shared by the United States and the United Kingdom. On the other side, the Soviets were adamant about keeping hold of Eastern Europe in order to protect themselves from a potential resurgence of German aggression. They were also adamant on establishing communism globally, partly for ideological reasons. By 1947 to 1948, when the Marshall Plan brought Western Europe under American influence and the Soviet Union had established openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe, the Cold War had become more entrenched. In 1948 to 1953, the Cold War was at its height. The Soviet Union attempted to blockade the parts of West Berlin controlled by the West but failed. 1948 to 49. The United States and its European allies established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a unified military command to oppose the Soviet presence in Europe. 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic warhead, ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. 1949, the Chinese Communists took control of mainland China. 1949, and the Soviet-supported communists in Cuba. 1949. The longtime Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 was a major factor in the Cold War tensions easing between 1953 and 1957, but the standoff persisted. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of the nations of the Soviet Union, was established. The same year, West Germany was granted membership in NATO. The years 1958 to 1962 saw another intense phase of the Cold War. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles began between the United States and the Soviet Union, and in 1962 the Soviets started covertly deploying missiles in Cuba that might be used to conduct nuclear assaults on American cities. This generated the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which took the two countries to the verge of war until a deal to remove the missiles was negotiated. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were prepared to deploy nuclear weapons out of fear of the other's reaction and, consequently, of mutual atomic destruction. the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited above-ground nuclear weapons testing, was swiftly signed by the two superpowers. However, the crisis also strengthened the Soviets' resolve to never again be humiliated by their inferior military strength, and they started to build up both conventional and strategic forces that the United States was compelled to match for the following 25 years. Throughout the Cold War, the US and the USSR avoided open military conflict in Europe and limited their use of combat operations to preventing allies from switching sides or to overthrowing them after they did. Thus, in order to maintain communist authority in East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968, and Afghanistan, 1979, the Soviet Union dispatched troops. For its part, the United States supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba in 1961, invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965, Grenada in 1983, and engaged in a protracted 1964-75 and fruitless attempt to stop Communist North Vietnam from annexing South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But as the 1960s and 1970s progressed, the conflict between the Soviet and American blocs gave way to a more complex system of international relations in which the world was no longer divided into two distinctly antagonistic blocs. The Soviet Union and China had a significant disagreement that began to grow in 1960 and shattered the communist bloc's cohesiveness. Western Europe and Japan, meantime, saw robust economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s, which helped to lessen their relative disadvantage to the United States. Less powerful nations had more freedom to establish their independence and frequently demonstrated that they were unafraid of being forced or cajoled by superpowers. As evidenced by the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, that resulted in the SALT I and II agreements of 1972 and 1979, respectively, the two superpowers reduced the number of anti-ballistic missiles and strategic missiles that could carry nuclear weapons during the 1970s. In the early 1980s, as the two superpowers continued their major armament buildup and fought for influence in the Third World, there followed a period of heightened Cold War tensions. But in the late 1980s, under Mikhail S. Gorbachev's leadership, the Cold War started to disintegrate. He started the process of democratizing the Soviet political system and eliminated the authoritarian elements of the Soviet regime. Gorbachev consented to the fall of communist governments in the former Soviet Union's Eastern European nations in the years 1989 to 1990. Following the election of democratic administrations in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the unification of West and East Germany under NATO's auspices, again with Soviet approval, took place immediately after. In the meantime, Gorbachev's internal reforms had weakened his own Communist Party and allowed power to move to Russia and the other Soviet Union constituent republics. Late in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart, giving birth to 15 new independent countries, including a democratically elected anti-communist government in Russia. The Cold War was finally over. The fear of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union characterized the Cold War as a period of tension and unpredictability. As the two superpowers competed for supremacy on the world stage, it was a time of proxy conflicts, espionage, and political gamesmanship. The Cold War ended in 1991, bringing this chapter of history to a risky and unsettling finish. Both world politics and the global economy were significantly impacted by the Cold War. Both sides invested a significant amount of money and resources to ensure their military superiority as a result of the arms race and the development of nuclear weapons, which resulted in a costly and deadly arms buildup. The prospect of nuclear conflict was omnipresent, and everyone in the planet constantly feared a disastrous worldwide conflict. Despite this, there were also times of détente and cooperation during the Cold War. In addition to helping to ease tensions between the two superpowers, the signing of arms control agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty also contributed to a greater sense of understanding between the two countries. The Cold War's end marked a risky and unsettling finish to this era of history. The bipolar international order came to an end with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and a new era in world affairs began. It also signaled the appearance of fresh difficulties and dangers like terrorism, ethnic unrest, and the spread of WMA. Thank you for watching. Follow for more.